All right. Good evening, everyone. I don't know if you can see me, but I promise I'm here. Good evening. I'm Arthur Urbano, professor of. There I am. Okay, professor of theology and chair of the Jewish Catholic Theological Exchange Committee here at Providence College, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you who are joining us this evening, in person and online, for the Scholar in Residence Dialogue, Aristotle Among the Believers, How Jews, Christians, and Muslims Made the Philosopher Their Own. This is a special evening for us. Anytime we talk about Aristotle at a Dominican college, it's a special day, but it's also the first time we are hosting a trialogue featuring the three great monotheistic traditions. And with Ramadan underway and Passover and Easter not all that far off, not to mention spring break, finding a date to bring our three wonderful speakers together was no small interfaith feat, but we managed to do it. And I thank them for being here tonight. Tonight's program was conceived and organized by Dr. Benny Bar-Lavi, the inaugural scholar in residence in Jewish studies and Jewish Christian relations here at Providence College. It's reflective of his research and intellectual interests in the historical relations among these three traditions, conversations that he has brought here to the public forum, and also to the classroom where I've had the great pleasure of teaching with him the past 2 years. Dr. Bar-Lavi will be the moderator for this evening's dialogue. So just some housekeeping before I turn the floor over to Benny. Tonight's event is being recorded and will be available on our website, jews-catholics.providence.edu. There you can also learn more about the work of the JCTE, and perhaps even make a gift to help us continue the important work of interreligious learning and engagement that reaches our classrooms and extends out into the local community. After our speakers have given their presentations and spent some time in discussion with each other, there will be time for questions from both the in-person and Zoom audiences. For those of you on Zoom, I invite you to place your questions in the Q&A at any time over the course of the evening, and my colleague, Father Gabriel, will get to those during the Q&A. And just a reminder to everyone speaking tonight, please do make sure to speak directly into the mic so that the Zoom audience can hear and we get a nice clear recording. So without any further delay, I'll hand things over to Benny, who will introduce the topic and our speakers.
College community, Providence Jewish and Catholic communities, and to the general public, thank you all for being here. Let's begin. For a great many Jewish, Christian, and Muslim thinkers in the medieval world, Aristotle was not just a philosopher, but the philosopher, an essential reference point for understanding both nature and the divine. For Avicenna, Ibn Sina, the preeminent philosopher scientist of the Islamic world, he dubbed Aristotle as the first teacher, Al-Mu'allim al-Awwal. Aristotle's works were translated into Arabic and studied from the 9th century onward. In addition to Avicenna, other influential philosophers such as Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi built their intellectual systems largely on Aristotelian foundations. But perhaps no one better illustrates the admiration for Aristotle in the Islamic world than Ibn Rushd, Averroes, who championed Aristotle as a supreme guide to truth and philosophy, writing extensive line-by-line commentaries on Aristotle's works, commentaries that ironically would have a great impact not among Muslims, but among Christians and Jews. Maimonides, known in Hebrew by the acronym Rambam, and the foremost Jewish intellectual figure in medieval Judaism, said that Aristotle was, quote unquote, the chief of the philosophers, Rosh Philosophim, in the Hebrew translation from Arabic, and that he had reached the utmost limit possible for a human being, surpassed only by those gifted with divine prophecy. The debate surrounding Aristotelianism arguably became the most important topic in Jewish philosophy. Aristotle's works along with commentaries such as those of Averroes, were translated from Arabic into Hebrew and exerted an immense influence among the Jews of Sepharad until the 16th century. Aquinas, the Doctor Angelicus, and the foremost medieval scholastic, referred to Aristotle as just the philosopher, reflecting his authority in all matters of natural reason. But perhaps the most famous testament to Aristotle's immense stature in Western Christendom is found in Dante's Divine Comedy, which places Aristotle in limbo along with other virtuous pagans. Dante describes Aristotle as follows: "When I had raised my eyes a little higher, I saw the master of the men who know, maestro di color che sanno, seated in philosophic family. There, all look to him, all do him honor." Yet while his authority was indisputable, Aristotle was also very, very problematic, as his inquiries and theories often stood in tension with God's revealed truth. These three topics in particular came to be seen as clashing with core beliefs of what we have come to define as the Abrahamic religions. First, Aristotle argues for the eternity of the world in contrast to its creation out of nothing by God. Two, Aristotelian metaphysics did not leave room for miracles, divine knowledge of particulars, or divine providence, at any rate as traditionally understood. And three, Aristotle's theory of the soul was seen as potentially contradicting personal immortality, and even more so, resurrection, a core belief in all three religions. Aristotle was thus not only critiqued, but also modified and sometimes rejected, including by admirers such as Avicenna, Maimonides, and Aquinas. Even his greatest detractors, thinkers such as the Jewish Chasdai Kreskas, the Muslim Al-Ghazali, and the Christian Duns Scotus, first had to grapple with Aristotelian thought as a prerequisite to formulating their own anti-Aristotelian philosophical theological systems, often defining their positions in opposition to his enduring intellectual legacy. The dynamic of admiration, modification, rejection will provide the background for a conversation today, which will explore the philosopher's complex heritage among Jews, Christians, and Muslims, analyzing the mutual influences, points of contention, and no less importantly or interestingly, parallel developments that shaped the ways in which Aristotle was Judaized, Christianized, and Islamized. So in terms of the structure of the dialogue, each panelist will present for about 15 minutes, after which they will have the opportunity to respond to one another's presentations. And afterward, we'll open the floor for questions. Now, rather than adhering to the chronology of divine revelation, we're going to do something else tonight. And broadly speaking, we'll trace Aristotle's medieval philosophical reception among the three faiths. So in other words, we'll begin with Islam, move to Christianity, and conclude with Judaism. So I'm excited to introduce our three panelists, each of them an expert on Aristotle's reception in Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, respectively. Dr. Emann Allebban is assistant professor in the Department of Theology at Providence College. She specializes in Islamic philosophy and theology. Her research explores the ways in which philosophers of the Islamic world systematically investigated the world, both from natural science to metaphysics to rational theology, as distilled through the lenses of both Greek and Islamic frameworks. Rabbi Yaakov Taubes teaches Jewish history at Yeshiva College. His research focuses on the organization of knowledge in medieval and early modern Hebrew books, with special interest on the history of alphabetization, as well as the history of the sermon. He also serves as the rabbi at Mount Sinai Jewish Center in Washington Heights, New York. Father Philip-Neri Reese is a Dominican friar of the Providence of St. Joseph and a professor of philosophy at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas, the Angelicum in Rome. He's also the principal investigator for the Angelicum Thomistic Institute new project on philosophy and Thomistic tradition. His main area of research is metaphysics and anything adjacent to it, with a special emphasis on the metaphysical thought of St. Thomas Aquinas and its subsequent reception and interpretation. So without further ado, I'm going to let my colleagues, the panelists, present.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming out today and for the kind invitation of including me today. Very excited to think about these questions with all of you. I want to begin with a dream. It's one of the most powerful early images of Aristotle in classical Islam that comes to us from a narration of the dream of an Abbasid caliph, Al-Ma'mun. Mention of the reasons why books on philosophy and other ancient sciences became plentiful in the country. One of the reasons for this was that Al-Ma'mun saw in a dream the likeness of a man, white in color, with a ruddy complexion, broad forehead, joined eyebrows, bald head, bloodshot eyes, and good qualities sitting on his bed. Al-Ma'mun related, "It was as though I was in front of him, filled with fear of him. Then I said, 'Who are you?' He replied, 'I am Aristotle.' Then I was delighted with him and said, 'O sage, may I ask you a question?' He said, 'Ask it.' Then I asked, 'What is the good?' He replied, 'What is good in the intellect?' I said again, 'Then what is next?' He answered, 'What is good in the law?' I said, 'Then what more?' He answered, 'More? There is no more.' And then, according to another narration, Ma'mun said, 'Give me something more.' And Aristotle replied, 'I advise you to affirm the oneness of God.' For context, Ma'mun was the son of the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who became the symbol of Islamic civilization and flourishing in medieval Islamic sources. Harun al-Rashid also became a famed figure in early modern European literature for his role in the Thousand and One Nights. Ma'mun carried on his legacy, in particular the well-known translation movement. The translation movement was a broad and sustained effort responsible for translating a significant volume of Greek texts into Arabic. While the movement translated from many languages into Arabic, including Pahlavi, Sanskrit, Syriac, and Greek, it is often referred to as the Greco-Arabic translation movement because it was predominantly focused on translating the works of Hellenistic scholars and other Greek texts into Arabic. The translation movement took place in Baghdad from the mid-8th century. Ma'mun is credited with sending out emissaries far and wide in search of ancient scientific and literary texts, which he then had translated into Arabic. He sometimes even attended in person the scholarly discussions of these works at his court. There's several points to take away from this dream. As scholars have noted, the dream occurs at a pivotal time in terms of religious and theological dispute in Islam. One of the central questions concerned the role of reason versus scriptural sources. Aristotle is invoked here to adjudicate the question. His pithy first response to Ma'mun's question, "What is good?" is what is good in the intellect. There's two ways of reading this, at least two. The first is that what is good is what is known through the intellect, or what is in accordance with the intellect. So in this sense, Aristotle's answer was more specific and meant to respond to those theologians and jurists at the time who limited the use of reason in theological institutions. Another reading of the response has a broader scope, where he means to inform Ma'mun that what is good is philosophy, or philosophical inquiry. That is the ultimate moral good that one could pursue. This would, of course, vindicate all the money that Ma'mun was pouring into this translation movement, but it's also a stronger vision of philosophy that would be borne out in the later Islamic tradition, though this is not so well known yet. And I'll return to this point in a bit. The use of the term aql for reason is critical. as all of philosophical sciences would become known as the academias, or the rational sciences. There was a flourishing tradition of rational sciences, which included everything from metaphysics and logic to astronomy and optics from the 9th century to the 19th century. In many ways, this dream anticipated the emergence of the intellectual dimension of Islam that engaged Aristotle and other philosophical works in deep ways. Another notable point is that Aristotle notes in his second response that what is good in the law. This is meant to subordinate the role of Islamic law, in particular to subordinate both knowledge of the law and practice of external acts to a higher notion of the good. At the time, the jurists and interpreters and transmitters of scripture were enormously popular. Aristotle's response aims to bolster the work of the rational theologians and philosophers. Finally, Aristotle exhorts Ma'mun to embrace monotheism. This is an important addition where Aristotle, in one stroke, becomes, for all intents and purposes, a Muslim, or at least a monotheist. In later sources, this commitment to monotheism would be emphasized in many, though not all sources. After Ma'mun's dream, whether you are a fan of Aristotle or not, he would become known in the tradition as the first teacher, and Mu'allim al-Awwal, so paralleling the philosopher in the Latin. In this vein, medieval Islamic biographies and descriptions often Islamicized the Greek philosophers, depicting them as monotheists and affirming God's prophets. So, for example, in a pithy illustrated biography of Socrates, we find the following. Socrates was staunchly monotheistic, ate little, excessive in ritual worship, often remembered death, well-versed in physical exercises, of modest dress and food, excelled in logic, free of defects, and died of He noted that during the translation movement, Aristotle was by far the most translated philosopher into Arabic from any period. So virtually all the works of Aristotle were translated into Arabic, and by contrast, few of Plato's works were fully translated. His works didn't really garner the attention that Aristotle's did. This is remarkable if we consider the fact that Plato becomes just as authoritative a figure as Aristotle in the later tradition of Islamic thought. One reason might be that Aristotle's works appears to present a systematic body of philosophical science. That is, Aristotle's works concerned the science and knowledge of the causes of all the phenomenon on earth and in the heavens, culminating in the notion of this unmoved mover. Al-Farabi, one of the most influential proponents of Greek and Aristotelian philosophy in the Islamic world, states in The Attainment of Happiness, Aristotle sees the perfection of man as Plato sees it and more. However, because man's perfection is not self-evident or easy to explain by a demonstration leading to certainty, he saw fit to start from a position anterior to that from which Plato had started. So Aristotle saw fit to make known at the outset what the certain science is, how many classes it has, and so on. Rabbi goes on to enumerate all the areas of inquiry from logic to meteorology explored by Aristotle. His quote tells us a few things about the nature of the Islamic intellectual milieu. There was clearly an insatiable desire for deep knowledge in all areas of philosophical and scientific inquiry. This made Aristotle's corpus attractive and worth the enormous investment of the translation movement. Second, they appreciate that Aristotle starts from a position anterior to Plato. That is, Aristotle begins with more immediately known principles and empirical knowledge, whereas there was a sense that Plato was focused on the abstract world of form. In other words, Aristotle was admired for his engagement with demonstrating from first principles and responding to foundational criticisms of one's view. Philosophy was not a matter of subscribing to a school of thought or to a set of dogmas. This critical attitude is representative of the Islamic scientific and philosophical tradition, where works of shukuk, or critique were at the center of philosophical innovation. We see this again in the famous critique leveled by the prominent philosopher, theologian, and jurist Al-Ghazali, which is a site where the really complicated relationship between Aristotle and Islam is perhaps best illustrated. In the introduction to his Incoherence of the Philosophers, Ghazali announces his concern with those who have, quote, passed off the reins of religion by falling prey to imitation and, quote, sophistical doubts that divert from the direction of truth. He writes, quote, the source of their unbelief is in their hearing high-sounding names such as Socrates, Hippocrates, Plato, Aristotle, and their likes, and the exaggeration and misguidedness of groups of their followers in describing their minds. We learn here something about the perception of Aristotle and the Greeks in Ghazali's milieu, that they have a sort of exalted cool status. They're kind of the cultural elite of the time. It's who you want to be associated with, right? So it's what, as Ghazali puts it, sets you apart from, quote, the masses and the commonality. We also learn here that Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates have a reputation of not just being super smart and accomplished, but that they, quote, don't believe in the gods of the city, to put it in familiar terms, to recall the accusations that were leveled against Socrates by the people of Athens. That is, this group that is enamored with Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, they also take them to have rejected religion and the basic tenets of belief, and they have followed suit. Ghazali continues by reprimanding them for hastily adopting them and discarding the faith of their forebears. Ghazali may or may not pepper his critique with some low-key name calling, like imbeciles, dimwits, and parrots. And then he turns to announcing his aim in writing the book at hand. Quote, I took it upon myself to write this book in refutation of the ancient philosophers, to show the incoherence of their belief and the contradiction of their word in matters relating to metaphysics, to uncover the danger of their doctrine and its shortcomings. So speaking to this question of how Aristotle was received in the Islamic tradition, this sounds like a pretty damning assessment of the Greek philosophical heritage and those who follow it in the Islamic world. And this is certainly a story that has been told with a long history and great traction. So great, in fact, that it can be found widely, from public scholarship to science documentaries like by Neil deGrasse Tyson. You nodded like you've seen this one. It's always odd when you're confronted with someone who's not an expert talking about your expertise and just saying the oddest things. So here's an example, right? So this is known to scholars as the decline thesis. The thought was that the post-classical period of Islamic thought was devoid of intellectual creativity and development. Philosophy and the rational sciences enjoyed a brief golden age in the Islamic world, featuring dynamic philosophers such as Kindi, Farabi, and Avicenna. But then, so the narrative goes, this flourishing came to a premature end in the 12th century when Muslim theologians, led by Ghazali, attacked and banished Greek thought and rational discourse up until the modern period. The Islamic world was invigorated by and preserved the Greek heritage during the European, quote, Dark Ages, handed it over to the Latin West, and once safely in their arms, the Islamic world went back to sleep. So this is the story. The story can still be found more recently in the great scholar of Islamic theology, Joseph Van Esker. Unfortunately, we now know this story was a product of what we might call armchair scholarship. That is, doing the history of philosophy without actually examining the history, the sources of this later period, as well as a selective reading of Ghazali. So let me touch on both of these points, the sources of this period and the selective reading of Ghazali, because I think both bear on our question tonight. Recently, scholars of Islamic intellectual history have uncovered an enormous corpus of unexamined manuscripts from the post-classical period of Islamic, so roughly 1100 to 1900. The sources cover a wide range of humanist disciplines, are authored by Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and other thinkers, and span modern-day Spain to West and North Africa, Southeast Asia. In their initial assessment of about 800 new sources, it was found that over 90% of these works have yet to be examined or even edited. The bulk of these sources are in the form of manuscripts or lithographs and fall under the broad label of the rational sciences. So this is a groundbreaking article published in 2004 by one of my thesis supervisors at McGill, Robert Wisnowski. He presented this initial survey of a wide range of sources produced in this post-classical period. Significantly, this initial list, limited to sources produced after the 12th century, has more recently been expanded by Wisnowski and others. The size of this corpus is simply enormous. And to give you a sense, I thought I'd just put up a few pages of the initial list. It's 23 pages. I did not put up here. But these are originally they're works that we are just now beginning to learn about by a variety of different things. So the discovery of these new sources in the last decade has forced us to re-examine the story of the time. And more directly to our topic tonight, this is to recognize that my comments today are quite limited. I've so far only referenced thinkers in the so-called classical period, so Farabi, Avicenna, Ghazali, because that's the state of current Western scholarship, which is largely focused on the 9th to the 12th century. And the honest answer is we don't really know yet what stories to tell about this later period, including this question of how Aristotle was received in the Islamic world. So it's a very exciting phase. We're still learning a lot about this new canon and kind of really radically revising what we once thought we knew about this time. So here, let me move to my second point about this story of an antagonistic reception of Aristotle, that it's based on a crass reading of Ghazali. We can see this by continuing our read. After going off on those who embraced the Greek philosophers and abandoned religion, he says they are, quote, moving from one mode of imitation to another, where they had formerly held to faith by imitation, he's saying, and are now abandoning faith, again in imitation of the Greek philosophers. So he's advancing a critique of blind imitation of his contemporaries who almost as a cool fad have taken to Greek philosophy and rejected faith under the pretense of being enlightened, when in reality he thinks they're sloppy students of Greek philosophy. We find this in the next few lines where the discussion takes a turn. Whoever believes that adorning oneself with imitated unbelief shows good judgment and induces awareness of one's quick wit and intelligence would desist, as it'll become verified for him that those prominent and leading philosophers he emulates are innocent of this imputation, that on the contrary, they believe in God and his messengers. So here we find Ghazali not saying that he's going to reject Greek philosophy, but that they got Aristotle and the Greeks wrong because they are believers too. So make no mistake, he certainly thinks Aristotle and the preeminent Aristotelian in the Islamic world, Avicenna, got a lot wrong. And he thinks that he's dedicating much of his incoherence to showing just how wrong he thinks that they got it. But his critique is not theological or a bringing down of the hammer of orthodoxy, as the Decline story has painted it. After all, we're talking about the same figure who, in his autobiography, carries us through his painstaking search for the truth where he notices at some point in his adult life as this prominent religious figure in the Islamic world, with thousands of students following him in the world-class university of Baghdad, that he most likely wouldn't have ended up Muslim if he weren't born in a Muslim family and born in the place that he was born in. And this not being enough for him, he proceeds to be plagued with skeptical doubts about not just matters of faith, but the reliability of the senses, the reliability of reason, and so on. So if this sounds familiar, people often draw parallels between his autobiography and the first meditation of Descartes. And so Ghazali embarks on this search for truth where he considers the various paths and their merits and weaknesses, and he ends up settling on the path of Sufism as the surest path to certain knowledge. This becomes an important part of his critique of the philosophical path, and that is that he thinks reason can only take you so far, and that truest knowledge is a knowledge of the heart, a kind of light that God casts. So coming back to the incoherence, Ghazali advances a series of arguments against a range of views of the Greek philosophical tradition in Islam represented by Avicenna, with the recurring refrain that they claim to have shown things demonstratively using Aristotle's scientific program laid out in the posterior analytics, when in fact they haven't. We don't have time to get into the specifics here. There's a number of really interesting philosophical things that happen when Aristotle walks into the Islamic world. There are a number of examples that we can maybe talk more about in the discussion period. So the ways in which Avicenna develops various theories of causation that are at once Aristotelian, but also respectful of Quranic theology and God's relationship to the world. I want to end with a remark on what I take to be the most interesting and powerful thing that happens when Aristotle walks into the Islamic world. And that's that this is the first meeting between Islam and the West. It wasn't the Crusades. It wasn't colonialism. It wasn't modernization. It was this incredibly harmonious and fruitful meeting that inspired one of the largest intellectual translation movements in history, with profound effects on Islamic theology, philosophy, and Sufism. Islamic thinkers directly engaged the very same tradition and corpus that inspired the Western tradition, namely that of ancient Greece. My research and teaching revolve around developing the idea of this connection between the two worlds. So I think the work that we're doing here tonight, it has implications not just in terms of scholarship, but for anyone who's concerned with intercultural, interreligious dialogue. It's a powerful theme because what we find is that we can't understand Islamic thought without understanding Western philosophy. And to fully understand ourselves as Westerners, we've got to understand the ways in which Islam, Christianity, and Judaism engaged with and transformed this shared intellectual heritage that is Aristotle. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks everybody. I'm gonna try to move as briskly as I can through the slides that I've got. So my task tonight is to introduce to all of you the idea of what place Aristotle had among the Christians. So we just heard from Emann the sort of complicated place that Aristotle has among the great classical and potentially post-classical Islamic thinkers. My thesis is roughly that. The same thing is true with respect to the Christians. Aristotle has a complicated place among Christian thinkers. So the plan for the talk is very simple. I'm going to tell you a story, and then I want to look at two philosophical or theological case studies that are uniquely Christian, right? So Benny in his introduction mentioned a number of points of tension with respect to Aristotelian thought that are common among the three Abrahamic religions. I want to draw our attention this evening to at least two cases of tension that are unique to Christianity and Aristotle. So first, the story. The story begins with a question. I'll riff off of the title of a book by Alistair MacIntyre. So the question is this: if we're asking about Aristotle's place among the Christians, whose Aristotle are we asking about? And which Christianity are we talking about? So I'll begin with a tale of two Aristotles. Yeah, sorry to you guys. You can't see the fantastic slides that I have. So roughly painting with very broad strokes, we can say that in the history of philosophy and the pedagogy of teaching the history of philosophy, there are basically two Aristotles. There is what we can call the modern mainstream Aristotle, and then there is the Aristotle of literally everyone else in history. So what's the difference between these two Aristotles? The modern mainstream Aristotle is characterized by first being approached fundamentally and in a kind of default way from a developmental perspective, and then second by being approached fundamentally and in a kind of default way by embracing an oppositional perspective. So what do I mean by this? The developmental approach to Aristotle goes something like this. You start by surveying Aristotle's texts and then arranging them as best you can in chronological order. So which books did he write when he was a young grad student? Which ones did he write when he was a junior faculty member? Which ones did he write when he was writing his magnum opus as a mature scholar? And then if you notice tensions in the Aristotelian texts, the default way to resolve those tensions is by locating the texts at different points in his career. So the idea is, if there's a tension between something that he says in an early work and something that he says in a later work, then the resolution of the tension is to say he developed his doctrine. He changed his mind over time. And there are different ways that you can have a developmental approach. So one championed by Werner Jaeger, that is not a picture of Aristotle. So Werner Jaeger championed a particular kind of developmental thesis that blends into the second point about an oppositional presentation of Aristotle. So the oppositional presentation of Aristotle basically says this: the best way to understand what Aristotle was about is by looking at him as in contrast to other thinkers, and especially Plato, his doctoral supervisor, right? And so what you do is you contrast, right? So Aristotle was highly empirical, Plato was highly speculative. Aristotle is inductive, Plato is deductive. And you set up this series of contrasts that sets the one in opposition to the other. And the developmental approach and the oppositional approach can come together. So in Jaeger's thought, what you see is that Aristotle's development of thought and doctrine parallels, strangely autobiographically, Jaeger's development of thought and doctrine with respect to his own doctoral supervisor. So the young Aristotle is sort of naively Platonic, right? He's just sort of agreeing with everything that his doctoral supervisor says. And then the mature Aristotle is really ready to kind of break out and cast off the yoke of Plato and do his own thing. Other proponents of the modern mainstream Aristotle take exactly the opposite approach, right? So G.E.L. Owen and others say, no, no, no. The young Aristotle was really the one kicking against the goad. He was the one who was fiercely anti-Platonic. You know, he never listened to what his doctoral supervisor said. And then as he matured, he began to realize that maybe Plato was right about a lot more things. Oddly, the same intellectual trajectory as Owen. So that's roughly the modern Aristotle, is characterized by developmental approaches and oppositional approaches. The Aristotle of literally everyone else in the history of philosophy is non-developmental and largely non-oppositional. Now, what I mean by this is not that earlier thinkers like Thomas Aquinas or Avicenna or Farabi just thought that Aristotle was always entirely consistent, right? It's just this, that when faced with tensions between two texts, their default position was not to introduce a development of doctrine, but rather was to introduce a subtlety of thought, right? So they would ask, is there some way for me to speculatively reconcile the two passages? And if yes, do that. If no, go developmental. Same thing is true for the idea that the kind of classical Aristotle is approached in a non-oppositional way. So I'm not saying that everybody else in the history of philosophy just denied that Aristotle disagreed with Plato, right? Rather, it's that the default position was not to automatically assume that if Plato says P, then Aristotle says not P, and vice versa. It's to ask, is there a way to reconcile what Aristotle is saying with what Plato is saying? And if yes, go with that. So even among the great Neoplatonic thinkers in the history of philosophy, Aristotle was read pedagogically, right? You read Aristotle before you read Plato, not because you were going to read what you need to reject, and then by way of the via negationis, right? Just sort of modus tollens away from all of that when you get to Plato. No, the idea was that if you read Aristotle, that will set you up to read Plato well. That's only possible as a kind of pedagogical method if you think that that the default position is not opposition. So those are the two Aristotles, and it's the latter Aristotle, not chronologically, but in my presentation, that is the Aristotle that is received among the Christians. So this default position of non-developmental hypotheses and a default position of non-oppositional readings of Aristotle, and not just with Plato, but also with the Stoics, the pre-Socratics, etc. Now, a tale of three Christianities. So Aristotle is received not just in Christianity as a kind of homogeneous whole, but in a really important way by three heterogeneous Christian communities. So these are, from left to right, Latin Christianity, Greek Christianity, Syriac Christianity. For pedagogical reasons, I want to start with Greek Christianity. So what do I mean here? By Greek Christians, I mean largely Orthodox Christians. So, and by that, I mean at minimum, Christians who accepted the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Constantinople, and the Council of Ephesus. And these Greek-speaking Christians are predominantly Eastern, right? So the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire was in Constantinople, but the Eastern Empire spread further east than Constantinople itself. Latin Christians, like Greek Christians, were also Orthodox in the sense that they accepted the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Constantinople, and the Council of Ephesus. They, however, were Westerners, by which here I mean Latin speakers, right? And people living in the territory of the Western Roman Empire. Syriac Christianity, the one that never gets talked about, is, in contrast to Latin and Greek Christianity, is heterodox, by which I mean Syriac Christians largely rejected the third council that I mentioned, the Council of Ephesus. So they were, the pejorative term for them was Nestorians. So there's a heresy among Christians, we'll come back to this later, of Nestorianism. It said basically that Jesus of Nazareth is fundamentally two persons, a divine person and a human person, and each of those persons has a nature unique to it, a divine nature and a human nature. Like Greek Christians, these Syriac Christians were Easterners. So some of them lived in the territory of the Byzantine Empire, which was Christian, and some of them lived in the territory of first the Sassanid or Persian Empire, and then later in the territory of the first caliphates. So there's overlap there's also good chronological reason for us to start with Aristotle among the Muslims. Okay, so we've got these three Christianities. How is this more classical Aristotle received among them? Well, the answer is very easy for the Greeks, right? They just had him, right? They always had him. They non-problematically had him, just like they had all of Plato, all of the Greek philosophical tradition. There was no translation movement because they're reading it in the original. In roughly the 4th to 5th centuries AD for on the Christian counting, you have a partial translation from the Greek into Latin. This is associated, so names that you might associate it with this are Boethius, as one of the great early Latin translators, but it's only partial. So it's largely Aristotle's works on logic and argumentation that get translated into Latin in this early period. Next, in the other direction, is the reception of Aristotle among the Syriac Christians. So this is a part of the story that's rarely discussed, but from the 6th to 8th centuries, Syriac Christians directly translate Aristotle and basically all of Aristotle, unlike the Latin translations, into Syriac. That's really important because in the 8th to 10th centuries, you have the translation movement that Emann mentioned in her presentation. And that's a dual language translation movement. So some of the translators are translating directly from the Greek into Arabic, but many of the translators in Baghdad were Syriac Christians. And they were translating Aristotle from the Syriac into Arabic. Last, for the Christian story, is what often is referred to among medievalists as the translation movement, right? So this is the translation movement that gives us the full corpus of Aristotelian texts among the Latin Christians in the West. And that is a sort of a very rich movement that's layered. Because yes, you have translations directly from the Greek, but you also now have translations into Latin directly from the Arabic, right? Which I just said itself was derivative from the Syriac. And when Aristotle is being translated from Arabic, he's not lonely. So he's translated with friends. And those friends are all of the commentaries that had been written by classical Islamic scholars. So when the Latin West of the 12th and 13th centuries gets the non-logical works of Aristotle, they get it together with Averroes's commentaries. They get it together with the Latin translation of Avicenna's Shifa. They get it with a whole bunch of classical Islamic mediation, which in turn was itself influenced by early Syriac Christian mediation. So the Aristotle that the Latin West gets is a highly harmonized Aristotle, right? He's not an oppositional Aristotle, right? So so much of what Emann was saying in her first talk about the Islamicization, right, the monotheisization of Aristotle, that's just part of who Aristotle was as received in the Latin West. And that led to problems. So we can basically ask this question. For the Christians, was Aristotle friend or foe? Was he an ally in supporting the Christian religion, or was he an antagonist? And the answer is both. And the answer is both for all three Christian traditions. So among the Greek Christians, Aristotle was lumped under the broad category that was theorized as pagan learning. So the Byzantine Christian scholars were constantly asking questions about the legitimacy of pagan learning. And that includes Plato. It also includes Aristotle. Examples of Byzantine Christian thinkers who viewed Aristotle as a friend were, you will not be tested on these names, but for anyone who's interested, Patriarch Photius viewed Aristotle as a friend, Gennadius Scholarios viewed Aristotle as a friend, and the entire circle surrounding Princess Anna Komnene and her translation movement, all of them viewed Aristotle as friend. But some pretty big Byzantine names also viewed him as explicitly a foe. So Gemistius Plethon thought that Aristotle was basically the Antichrist. And Cardinal Bessarion also thought that the dedication to Aristotle that he saw among the Latin Christians was an absolute antithesis of Christianity. Another name that I could have put in this group, but is highly debated now in the scholarship, would be Gregory Palamas among the Byzantines. For Latin Christianity, Aristotle, as mentioned multiple times tonight, was seen as the philosopher. But that doesn't automatically mean friend. For many, it meant friend. For Boethius, it meant friend. For Albert the Great, Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, and I have to differ a little bit with Benny, even for John Duns Scotus, Aristotle was basically fundamentally a friend, and the liberties that he took, and he took them, right, were sort of, he was the black sheep of the family, but he was in the family. But to see that there were foes, people who saw Aristotle as a foe, all you need to look at in the Latin Christian tradition were the series of condemnations. So when Pierre de la Chapelle condemns Aristotle's works, and especially his works of natural philosophy, which contain many of the points of tension that Benny mentioned in 1210, right? He just says, these cannot be taught or read by art students, which basically means by bachelor's students in the university. Etienne Tempier, it wasn't enough for him to condemn a series of Aristotelian propositions once. He had to do it twice. So he did it in 1270, and then he did it again in 1277. And it really problematized for the Latin West the question of how acceptable Aristotle is and how compatible Aristotle is, especially with the thought of Augustine, but just broadly with Christian theology in general. The least studied of all of these is the Syriac Christian tradition. So I don't have a pithy little quote to give you here, but I can give you some names that I am morally certain none of you are familiar with. So among the friends of Aristotle among the Syriac Christian traditions include Paul the Persian, Bar Hebraeus, who's basically like the Nestorian Thomas Aquinas, and Marodisho. And then foes of Aristotle among the Syriacs include Ibas of Edessa, Abraham Beth Rabban, and then Mar Babai the Great, who kind of reformed the main center of Christian learning in the Syriac world, which was the school at Nisbis. Okay, so we see Aristotle presented in a complicated way in all three Christian traditions. Why? Well, I'll give you two case studies. One where Aristotle looks like a friend, and one where Aristotle looks like a foe. Both uniquely Christian. So first, Christology, right? So Christology is the study of the person of Jesus Christ as understood by Christian dogmatics. Well, there are three core positions that you can take in Christology, at least in this period. First, you can be a Nestorian, and you can give an argument for your view. The argument goes like this: a person is just an instance of a nature. So I'm a human person. Why? Because I'm an instance of human nature. The Archangel Gabriel is a person. Why? Because he's an instance of angelic nature. God, the Holy Spirit, is a person. Why? Because he's an instance of divine nature. But in Christ, the Nestorians say, we maintain that there are two instances of two natures. There's the instance of human nature that he has, and the instance of divine nature. Therefore, in Christ, there must be two persons. Two persons, two natures, that's just Nestorianism. Another Christian heresy, at least among the Orthodox Christians, is called Monophysitism. You can think of it as the opposite end of the spectrum from Nestorianism. So the Monophysites start with the same first premise. They agree, a person, that's just an instance of a nature. But the Monophysites agree with the Council of Ephesus. So we know that in Christ there's only one person. Therefore, they conclude there must be only one instance of one nature in Christ. So there's one physis, one nature in Christ, that because Christ is a divine and human person, must be a single divine and human nature. You see, they're syllogizing here. They're syllogizing their way into heresy. The Orthodox Christian view avoids these two heresies the only way it logically can, by denying the shared premise of both the Nestorians and the Monophysites. So the Orthodox Christians are just going, if they want to avoid both of those heresies, they have to say that it's false, that a person is just an instance of a nature. How do you do that? Well, here's Boethius's Aristotelian way into orthodoxy. He begins by giving a deeply Aristotelian definition of a person, right? So he says, no, a nature is not a person is not an instance of a nature. A person is an individual substance that has a rational nature. So the nature isn't the thing that is. Boethius uses the language of id quod est in Latin. The nature is that by which the person that has the nature is what he is. So I am not my humanity. I have my humanity, that my human nature, and it's by quo for Boethius, in and through by my nature that I am made human. But I, the person, am the individual substance. Substance language, and especially primary substance or individual substance, is all Aristotle, right? So Aristotle's got this fundamental metaphysical division between substance and accidents, and he distinguishes two kinds of substance, secondary substance and primary substance. Boethius, when he says an individual substance of a rational nature, he's just saying it's a primary substance that has, without being identical to, a nature. And so in Christ, that primary substance, that individual substance, that one person has two natures, divine nature and human nature. Through the divine nature, he has all of his divine characteristics. Through the human nature, he has all of his human characteristics. But that's not Aristotelian enough for Boethius, right? Aristotle is also in Boethius's hands, comes to our rescue by giving an explicit argument against Nestorianism. Here's how that argument goes. If there are two persons in Christ, then the union in Christ is merely accidental. So this is another piece of Aristotelian philosophy. He distinguishes between certain unities that are substantial unities, robust unities, profound unities, and then there are other unities that are totally superficial. So think of the unity, and I'm putting that in scare quotes, of a pile of sand. There's nothing deep and metaphysical that unites all the grains of sand, right? Blow on them, it disappears, right? And a substance, an individual substance, is not like that. It can't be like that. An individual substance is an agent with autonomous action, right? That's moving around and doing things in the world. It has to have a robust unity. So if there are two persons in Christ, then the union between those two persons is going to be more like a heap of sand. It would be more like the union of Emann and I, right? We're friends, we hang out, right? But like Emann doesn't die if I go back to Rome, right? You might, yeah. Well, die of sorrow, yeah, exactly. But the two things united can be what and who they are without the union. But Boethius says the union in Christ is not merely accidental. It can't be like that. It has to be more than just friendship between an instance of divine nature and an instance of human nature. Jesus has to be more than just God's friend. So there cannot be two persons in Christ. Boethius uses Aristotle's distinction between paroccidens and per se, or substantial unities, in order to refute the Nestorian heresy. So Aristotle, friend, right? Well, case study 2, the Eucharist. Now Aristotle is going to look a lot more like an aggressor, because here's a very natural Aristotelian line of thought. It also relies on substances and accidents. So it's a very Aristotelian thing to think that it's impossible for an accident to exist. So something like a quantity or a quality or a relation, those are all accidents in Aristotle's metaphysics. Something like that can't exist unless it exists in a substance, right? So my weight can't exist if you take me away, right? My baldness, my paleness, right? Those, take me away, you take those qualities, those relations, those characteristics away. But in the Christian doctrine of the Eucharist, that's what you have. You have an accident, a quantity, right? So the quantity of the bread, the weight of the bread, the shape of the bread, all of that supposedly remains even after the words of consecration, where the bread is, the substance is completely converted into Christ. So you have the existence of accidents without a substance. And that the Aristotelian is going to think is impossible. Therefore, the Eucharist is impossible. So what do? One thing is you just reject Aristotelianism on this point. And many Christian thinkers did in the Latin West. Aquinas tries something different. He's got what he takes to be an Aristotelian answer, but I think any honest, transparent analysis is going to admit that the Aristotelianism of Aquinas's answer is questionable at best. So here's Aquinas's move. He says, it would only be impossible for an accident to exist without existing in a substance if existing in a substance were part of the very definition of an accident, right? So it's the definition of a circle to be a bound figure, every point of which is equidistant from a center, which means it's impossible for there to be a line that has two radii of different lengths. That's impossible because it's just incompatible with the definition. But Aquinas says, existing in a substance isn't part of the definition of an accident. So it isn't impossible for an accident to exist without existing in a substance. Therefore, the Eucharist isn't impossible, and God can do it by divine power. Now, any classical Aristotelian is going to feel very uncomfortable with this account. So here, even some of the best Aristotelians among the Christian tradition they got to stretch for it, right? You got to really reach for it to keep your Aristotle on that one. So where does this leave us? Does Aristotle have a place among the Christians? Yes, absolutely he does. Without qualification or hesitation, he does. But what is Aristotle's place among the Christians? Well, on that one, it's complicated, right? We've seen that in all three Christian traditions, in some respects he's friend, in some respects he's foe. We've seen uniquely Christian theological issues where he looks like both. And so the Christians have to grapple with his presence within our tradition. And that is how it was in the past, and that's how it is now. So thanks.
mentioned in my introduction, well, first I want to thank panelists and the organizer. I mentioned in the introduction that one of my areas of research is alphabetizations. You may have noticed that is the order in which we spoke. There may have been other reasons behind that. Although Judaism's encounter with Aristotle is arguably older than or precedes both with Christianity and Islam, as we're going to see, it is really only in an Islamic and a Christian orbit that Jewish Aristotelianism could take off. First, I want to start with something a little more modern. In 1994, the American comedian, actor, and songwriter Adam Sandler, I don't know if I'm giving myself, but even quoting him, but he was highlighted at the Super Bowl, so obviously some people know who he is. He released a hit song called the Hanukkah Song, in which he noted famous celebrities that were Jewish. This is before Spotify, so it's hard to know exactly how many times it was played, but my memory is that it was played fairly incessantly on the radio and at parties. To be honest, I have not thought about this song very much in the past, however many years that is, until a friend of mine recently showed me an article which noted all the mistakes in the song, i.e. people were claimed to be Jewish but were not actually. And he tried to contextualize as a part of a larger Jewish movement of claiming the Judaism or Jewish origin of certain ideas of questionable historicity or motivation or results. Leaving the contemporary issue aside, the question of the Jewish origin of Aristotle and Aristotelianism was no small matter to Jews in the medieval period, and it manifested as an issue that had to be confronted if it was going to be engaged seriously. There is inherent tension to putting the Hebrew Bible and Jewish thought under philosophical lens. Although major sectors of medieval Jewry believed that a divine imperative required the cultivation of learning in the broadest sense, which certainly could include philosophical thinking, any enterprise that was shared equally with humanity at large could not be perceived as quintessentially Jewish. Thus, even Jews profoundly committed to a philosophical agenda and who felt that Jewish learning could be enriched by such pursuits had to confront the instinct that only Torah, that is the Hebrew Bible and the oral law given to Moses at Sinai, was Torah and thus divine and nothing else. Only by suggesting that philosophical pursuits themselves were in some way part of the Torah itself could the endeavor be properly justified and even mandated. Grounding Aristotle and his ideas in Jewish faith and concepts was not just a source of pride, apologetics, or even polemics, as much it was part of a justification for the entire philosophical endeavor. For many Jews, it was only if his ideas could be shown to be in line with or rooted in Judaism that they could be considered worthwhile. With that in background, we can approach the subject of tonight's talk. Aristotle among the believers, how Jews made the philosopher their own. Although most of our story tonight is from the medieval period, it would do us well to begin in antiquity, when some Jews began to actually claim Aristotle or Aristotelian thinking as their own. While Aristobulus of Alexandria, for example, who flourished in the 1st century before the Common Era, one of the earliest known figures who tried to reconcile religion with philosophical thought, was said to have claimed that all the ideas of the great Greek thinkers, including those of Aristotle, could already be found in the Hebrew Bible, although he did not elaborate how that could be done. While the extant writings of Aristotle make no mention of a Jewish encounter, the 1st century Roman Jewish general turned historian Josephus tells a fascinating story whereby Aristotle describes his meeting with the Jews and is generally being very impressed with their original way of thinking. Josephus's point was to respond to Apion, a Roman thinker and writer who had critiqued the uncivilized Jewish thinking and their lack of true antiquity. Josephus cites this tale from a lost book of Heroes, a member of Aristotle's school, to demonstrate an affinity between Aristotelian thinking and Jewish thought. Again, you can see it quickly here. I won't read it inside to save time. But essentially, he describes the Jews as those worthy of study and generally being impressed with them. This story would be later misquoted as proving that Aristotle was actually Jewish and from the tribe of Benjamin. Others would claim, based on a passage in Yoma, again a Talmud in the tractate Yuma, describing Alexander the Great's encounter with Simeon the high priest and subsequent sparing of Jerusalem. Again, Alexander is coming to conquer Jerusalem, and then he sees the high priest and says, "No, we can't attack. I've seen this man in my dream before," and he ultimately does not attack the city. And Simeon, according to some version of this, subsequently presented books containing the wisdom of Solomon to Alexander the Great, who then showed him to his teacher Aristotle, from which Aristotle developed his philosophy. Suggesting that the great philosopher Aristotle must have gotten ideas from the wisest man of all time, King Solomon, grounded this Greek wisdom as ultimately deriving from Jewish thought. While it is plausible or even likely that Aristotle's thinking influenced Jews living in Alexandria and elsewhere in the Roman Empire and antiquity, the surviving sources do not preserve anything of substance. Even more important for our tonight's story, the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Midrash, the great rabbinic works preserving what was known as the oral law, make no mention of Aristotle, although Greek wisdom is referenced a few times, usually to disparage it. It was only in the 8th or 10th through 10th century that the philosophy of the Greeks in general, and Aristotle in particular, began to emerge in Jewish thought. To explain this, my teacher David Berger has noted that in ancient times, the philosophical culture was part of a pagan world that stood in stark opposition to Jewish beliefs. Under such circumstances, committed Jews, unqualified rejection of that civilization was seen as superior to struggling or coming to grips with the issues that it raised. Although the philosophical culture of antiquity retained its dangers for medieval Jews under Islam, the culture which they were in immediate contact confronted the legacy of the past in a fashion that joined Muslims and Jews in a common philosophic request. Indeed, it is likely that the very commonality of the enterprise served as an attraction for Jews. Members of a minority might well have embraced the opportunity to join the dominant Islamic society in an intellectual quest that was held in the highest esteem. Over time, as was noted, Baghdad had emerged as the intellectual capital of the world. And I produce here a quote from a traveler to Baghdad during the 10th century describing the climate. At the first meeting, there were present not only people of various Islamic sects, but also unbelievers, Magians, materialists, atheists, Jews, and Christians. In short, unbelievers of all kinds. Each group had its own leader, whose task it was to defend its views. And every time one of the leaders entered the room, his followers rose to their feet and remained standing until he took his seat. In the meantime, the hall had become overcrowded with people. One of the unbelievers rose and said to the assembly, "We are meeting here for discussion. Its conditions are known to all. You Muslims are not allowed to argue from your books and prophetic traditions. And I both. Everyone therefore has to limit himself to rational arguments." The whole assembly applauded these words. So you can imagine, says the traveler, that after these words I decided to withdraw. They proposed to me that I should attend another meeting in a different hall, but I found the same calamity there. It was in this world where works were being translated to Arabic that Aristotle was regularly quoted by several Jews as the philosopher, demonstrating his importance. If religious thought was subject to such treatment, we'd only expect for Aristotle's writings to become part of the curriculum of Jewish thinkers. Indeed, the most influential Jewish philosopher of the time was Rav Sadia al-Fayumi, known as Rav Sadia Gaon. While in modern Hebrew, Gaon means genius, at this time it referred to his role as the head of the Yeshiva, the school of advanced learning that served as the religious head of the broader Jewish community throughout the Caliphate and beyond. Sadia was interested in resolving faith and reason, and his magnum opus, translated as Emunot V'Deot, Arabic, English as Beliefs and Opinions or Belief and Doctrines, would become a classic. He was interested in utilizing the best sources and does not neatly belong to any one school of philosophy, although he clearly drew upon the methods and approaches of Mutan. He makes passing reference to Aristotle in the work, and ideas about the soul display strong Aristotelian influence. Sadia's blending of Islamic and Greek wisdom to better explain the Bible and Jewish ideas, and his use of Aristotle represented a move towards seeking out the best approaches in explaining Jewish thought. Philosophical thought flourished in Al-Andalus, the Jewish communities on the Iberian Peninsula in modern-day Spain, under the Umayyad Caliphate in the period often known as the Golden Age of Spanish Jewry. Although the idea of convivencia, the tolerant landscape that allows Jews and Christians and Muslims to live together and engage in dialogue, has largely been shown to be somewhat anachronistic, there is no question the immense output of literature, poetry, interest in science, and philosophy that became the norm there as Jews studying these topics and was part of a balanced education. Although Al-Farabi's work on Aristotle seemed to have been disseminated widely, it was Platonism and Neoplatonism the dominant ideas of the time, at least as far as the surviving works tell us, due to the influence of prominent Neoplatonists like Salman ibn Gabirol, among others. The first major indication that Aristotle had become more popular among the Jews comes from a source that denigrated him. Yehuda Halevi, Judah Halevi, born around 1075, a hotshot poet and writer, and perhaps even a celebrity in his youth. He thrived in the courtier culture that demanded and praised his talents he had for verse and sophisticated thought. But later in life, Halevi had a change of heart and turned against the culture he was born into. His most famous work, Arabic, translates as In Defense of the Despised Religion, but was later translated into Hebrew as just the Kuzari. The setting of this fascinating work is described in the introduction. The king of Khazaria was very careful and faithful in his idol worship. He then began to have a recurring dream in which he was told his intentions are good, but his actions are flawed. He then called a philosopher, a Muslim, and a Jew, and a Christian, Jew in such situations, to explain their religion so he can decide which one he should join. He quickly dispenses with all but the Jew, and the rest of the work is a dialogue between the Khazar king and the Jew called the Chaver. Although the philosophical character disappears early on in the work, philosophy is present in many places as an object of critique, where Aristotle is singled out. Misery 416. This is the king speaking, echoing something that the other said. Now I understand the difference between Elohim and Adonai, two names of God, and I can see how far the God of Abraham is different from that of Aristotle. Man yearns for God as a matter of love, taste, and conviction, while attachment to Elohim is the result of speculation. A feeling of the former kind invites the adherents to give their life for his sake and to prefer death to his absence. Speculation, however, makes veneration only a necessity as long as it entails no harm, but bears no pain for its sake. I could therefore excuse Aristotle for thinking lightly about the observation of the law, since he doubts whether God had any cognizance of it. At the same time, as scholars have noted, Halevi uses Aristotelian categories and syllogisms as part of his approach, indicating that such a way of thinking was normal, if not prevalent, and that he needed to use such language if his critique was to be seen as worthwhile. At the turn of the millennia, Aristotle had become popular, but there is little indication that he occupied a singular place in Jewish thought. But then all that changed. Likely to the renewed availability of Rabbi and Avicenna's commentary among others, Aristotle and Aristotelian thinking began to be seen as the primary path for resolving faith and reason. Abraham ibn Duad, often called the first Jewish Aristotelian, is best known for a historical work called Sefer Kabbalah, the Book of Tradition, which he told history of the world until his own time and affirmed historical periodization that have continued to influence conceptions of periodization until nowadays in much the way that history still looks at the trifold schema of antiquity, medieval modernity, despite all the various issues and flaws. Another talk. Ibn Duad's other work was of philosophical nature. Originally written in Arabic, only surviving in Hebrew, was known as the Munah Ramah, or Exalted Faith. Ibn Duad explains that he seeks to resolve the problems of divine foreknowledge and free will, a key theological issue in Judaism, already alluded to in the Talmud. Before he can address this question, however, he has various chapters and various other topics where he shows the flaws of Neoplatonism in favor of Aristotelianism, regularly citing Aristotle's categories, among other ideas. But this work's influence pales in comparison to the Jewish polymath that was mentioned earlier, who would do more in history to make Aristotle a household name among Jews, and that is Moses ben Maimon, better known as Maimonides. It is difficult to overstate the importance of Maimonides to all subsequent Jewish thought. It is nigh impossible to discuss Jewish thought prior to the modern period without incorporating Maimonides. Born in Spain in 1138, Maimonides eventually ended up in Egypt, where he would serve as physician in the court of the vizier of the sultan. His works on Jewish law, philosophy, medicine, logic, and commentary make him one of the most important Jewish thinkers of all time. While his earliest work displayed limited awareness and interest in Aristotelian ideas in Aristotle himself, his later ones, Aristotle emerges the most prominent and most commonly cited non-Jewish writer. Indeed, Aristotelian ideas can be found throughout that later thought. Perhaps the most extreme version of Maimonides' admiration for Aristotle that was alluded to in the introduction can be found in his letter to one of his students. In 1190, Maimonides had written his magnum opus of philosophy, the Latat al-Ha'irin, Judeo-Arabic, and later translated by Samuel ibn Tibon, a scion of a prominent family of translators in southern France, titled the work Moreh HaNevuchim, the Guide of the Perplexed. In a letter to Ibn Tibon, advising him to study these works in the proper translation, Maimonides names the philosophers that Ibn Tibon and others should study if they wish to understand his work. Prominent among them was Aristotle. The philosopher, Aristotle, had reached the highest degree of intellectual perfection open to man, barring only the still higher degree of prophetic inspiration. It is worth noting that Maimonides did not believe most Jews were worthy of prophetic inspiration, and this is not to be seen as disparaging. Since Aristotle was so important, coming close to the level of prophecy, his writings must have been considered worthy of study. This letter was widely disseminated, and later Jewish interest in Aristotle can be traced directly to Maimonides' admiration for him. It must be stressed, however, that Aristotle referred to and studied, which Aristotle, was that specifically interpreted by Averroes and Al-Farabi. Few of Aristotle's original works were translated into Hebrew, while almost all of Averroes were. Still, this letter whetted the appetite of Jews who want to study its sources, leading to a massive translation project of the original source into Hebrew that could be compared to the early one mentioned from Greek into Arabic. The guide itself would receive a competing translation by Yudah al-Kharizi, as well as by a new edition, and in the 13th century, printed edition, it would be translated into Latin as a Doctorum, and perhaps other versions as well, copied fairly widely. It's one of the first Jewish, and eventually translated to Spanish in the medieval period as well. It's one of the first Jewish works to receive a subject index, a scriptural source index, and has hundreds of surviving manuscripts, including some that are illuminated, as common for books besides the Bible. The translation of the guide thus led and coincided with a radical change in the study of Aristotelian philosophy among the Jews. There were four major manifestations of this change. The center of gravity shifted from Arabic-speaking lands to Christian world. Hebrew became the common language as Arabic. Averroes slowly supplanted Avicenna, and Aristotelian philosophy came to be disseminated in even wider fields. Despite this intense focus on Aristotle, with the writings of Maimonides, his works assume that one has already read Aristotelian works and does not really provide an overview. This task was filled by later encyclopedists, such as Judah ben Salman Cohen, who wrote a work called Midrash HaChachma, which perhaps should be translated as the search for wisdom, but was also playing on the Jewish works of Midrash to be a work that contains all of the wisdom, most notably Aristotle. Only portions of it survive and has not yet been published in any language. In any event, it was incredibly popular at its time, and there are many versions and imitators. While there is much about Aristotle that Maimonides and his followers found appealing, it has been suggested the most important influential ideas were Aristotle's concept of language, specifically the idea of symbolism and the understanding that symbolism could vary widely among peoples. For example, Maimonides' reinterpretation of biblical passages indicating God has a body, anthropomorphically, because of philosophical issues involved, owes its allegiance to, or owns its tradition to, Aristotle. To be clear, admiration of Aristotle did not equal total agreement. The aforementioned Judah cites his teacher, who's saying that Aristotle forgot to include the pigeon as an animal that lacks a gallbladder. There were more significant issues than that. As Daniel Frank has written, Maimonides is an Aristotelian on account of his creative use and adaptation of Aristotelian categories and arguments for his own purposes. That is the explication of religious tradition, but not Aristotle qua Aristotle. Perhaps the most significant disagreement was, as alluded to in the introduction, was Aristotle's claim to the eternality of the world. Traditional Jewish thought claimed the world was created ex nihilo and denied its eternality. Aristotle's belief to the contrary rattled many other Jewish thinkers. Nachmanides, Moses ben Nachman, referred to him as the accursed Greek, while others said he deserved to be hit on the head repeatedly for his mistake. Mentioned earlier that in the Divine Comedy of Dante, Aristotle is in purgatory. In a Jewish parody, satire version of this work by Emmanuel of Rome, called The Tale of Hell and Paradise, there being no purgatory in traditional Jewish thought, where the protagonist is guided through the divine realms by Daniel, if that's Daniel the prophet or Dante himself, Aristotle is placed in the bowels of hell due to his mistaken beliefs. Many admirers defended this mistaken belief that Aristotle did not have divine revelation to guide him. That's why he made this mistake, acknowledging the difficulty of the traditional position on logical grounds while still trying to maintain it. Joseph ibn Shebtom assured readers that he had on good authority that Aristotle had abandoned this belief in the eternality of the world at the end of his life and had converted to Judaism. Other writers, however, such as Joseph Gospi, Moses Narboni, two early commentators in the guide, claim that Aristotle had indeed proved the enemy of the world, and thus the position must be accepted. Others would later claim that Maimonides had changed his mind about this in deference to Aristotle. Another issue, Aristotle thinking was the idea of providence mentioned earlier, and divine foreknowledge would be taken up by Levi ben Gershon or Gershonides, but we'll leave that aside for now due to time. The Jewish focus on Aristotle would continue through the medieval period, with many defending the importance of subjecting Jewish belief to philosophical rigor in order to defend it from Christians who would regularly argue for the irrationalism of Judaism. Aristotle. From an intellectual historical point of view, the love affair with Aristotle would end with the Spanish crown rabbi Chasdai Crescus. Crescus' beloved only son had been killed in anti-Jewish riots in 1391 in the Kingdom of Aragon, which saw the death of thousands of Jews and the conversion of many more to Christianity. Crescus felt that many Jews had been misled by Aristotle and Maimonides' use of his ideas, and composed his work, Light of the Lord, to summarize and eviscerate the argument of the Greek, i.e. Aristotle, who, quote, darkened the eyes of Israel in his time. Here, as he writes, the sound of error and confusion is reliance on the works of the Greek and the proofs he adduced. It struck me as appropriate to highlight the fallaciousness of his proofs, the sophistry of his arguments, in order on this day to show all the nations that which removes confusion matters of faith and which lights all the darkness in the Torah alone, is the Torah alone. It says in Proverbs, for commandments is a lamp, Torah is light. Crescus saw the mass conversion of Jews because of mistakes based on Aristotelian thinking. While a true philosopher of his own and believed in the importance of philosophy, he felt that Aristotle had misled his co-religionists. Aristotle and his ideas continued to make appearances in Jewish thought through the 14th and 15th century, often as a launching point for a sermon, the way that someone might say, quote, some important idea or some idea that's in vogue, something from the local papers, as a starting point, and then bring it back to Torah. Bring it back to the topic. But these seem to be meant as oratorical or educational lines, demonstrating ideas that were in vogue, but there is certainly no indication that a Jewish source is being cited. In fact, they would often point out, this is an idea that they have, and this is what we have to say about it. I'll close with a brief anecdote. When I told my young son that I was going to deliver a talk about Aristotle, he said, isn't that the guy that Maimonides was obsessed with? Indeed, for the next few centuries, even those Jews who favored or were interested in Aristotelian thought, Aristotle at that point had become little more than the one that Maimonides was obsessed with. Thank you very much.
Thank you for really great, funny, and interesting presentations. We barely have time, but maybe one question from the audience to sort of wrap up.
Thank you so much. This is a big treat. I have a question that I thought this panel might answer, but it didn't even ask, which is why Aristotle? There were other ancient philosophers that you could have used. So you had Al-Farabi, who was a kind of a Neoplatonist. Certainly the Latins, certainly Boethius had some access to Stoics. Now this could have something to do with the history of transmission of Aristotle. He had a school, the Stoics didn't. Philosophers with schools get better transmitted. I have a hypothesis that I just wanted to serve up and see if you might be interested. Might it not have to do with his style, and that his texts lend themselves to the kind of literature that you have in all of these three traditions, namely commentary literature, where you say what you believe through writing about what somebody else thinks?
That's on. Yeah. So I think that is largely correct. I think there is one other piece I suspect, Emann, at least. I mean, I think Emann, you actually mentioned this in your talk. But I think another component of the attraction, at least for the late medieval Christian West, was the systematicity of it, right? So I mean, there isn't anything comparable among the Stoics, or I mean any of the other texts that the Latin West had access to, that it just, as soon as the whole corpus gets translated, you look at it and you think there's nothing he didn't do, right? Like he wrote on every branch of knowledge, right? And so it's interesting in just from an art perspective in the Latin West, there the artistic depictions of the arts and sciences are radically transformed from before the translation movement and after the translation movement, because the very way in which the Christian West is thinking about the division of all knowledge it's no longer fundamentally the liberal arts and the mechanical arts, right? It's, well, what did Aristotle write about? And it seems like it's everything. So you're right, like on a literary perspective, you've got it, but then also from a disciplinary perspective, it's just so systematic that if you want an education, it's just all right there. Do you guys have something to add?
No, I think I would say something really similar and almost building on what you've already suggested, which is that Aristotle's works just lend themselves to the sort of study and pursuit of the truth in a variety of sciences and logic and the mathematical sciences, biology, metaphysics, natural philosophy, and so on, that Plato's didn't. And that's not to say that Plato and the Neoplatonists were not important. That's a whole other panel maybe next year that there is so much to say about as well. And much of their work on Aristotle was there was the Aristotelian element, but there was also, they're very much working within a Neoplatonic cosmology, as Avicenna is. So I guess in response to that, I would take a cue from the Rabbi passage where he talks about Plato in comparison to Aristotle and says Aristotle starts from a position anterior to that from which Plato, and he goes on to say how Aristotle has laid it all out for us, kind of in a very systematic way, and in a demonstrative way that can be engaged, right? Even if you think he's not successful, which is Ghazali's whole argument.
The answer post Maimonides is Maimonides for Jews. Meaning once Maimonides did what he did, then the answer for why Aristotle, Maimonides. I don't think there's any way I could say that any simpler. Pre-Maimonides or Maimonides himself, I think someone was saying, particularly the metaphysics, Maimonides thought he had gotten it right the way that we would view science getting right on gravity. Who once said that this was fact. So if he got that right, then his ideas are worthy of study.
Okay, so please join me in thanking our panelists. This was really great, and please join me at the Great Hall. We're going to have kosher halal options, and you can continue asking questions to our panelists. Thank you for joining us. Good evening.